By the time the gavel fell, Nell Hargrove had exactly $1 left in the world, and she was about to spend every cent of it on a condemned barn that smelled of mildew and old rope. The town of Coldwater Bend watched her do it, and the town laughed. They had watched the bank take her farm 3 months before. They had watched her husband's grave go unmarked, because she couldn't afford a stone. Now they watched her raise a trembling hand at a dead man's estate sale, and bid on the one lot nobody else wanted, the leaning, rotted barn that had belonged to old Tobias Wren, the basketweaver who died alone and left behind nothing but broken chairs and a reputation for talking to himself. Beside her, pressed so close his ribs trembled against her skirts, stood a copper-coated hound named Briar, the only creature in Coldwater Bend who had never once looked at her like she was a fool. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nell Hargrove and her faithful dog Briar. If you have ever been the one folks whispered about, the one who kept going when everyone expected you to quit, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this story was written for you. There had been a time, not so long before, when the name Hargrove meant something good in Coldwater Bend. Daniel and Nell had built their farm from raw prairie with their own hands, arriving as little more than two hopeful strangers with a wagon, a mule, and a marriage license barely a week old. Folks used to say that Daniel Hargrove could coax wheat out of stone if the good Lord asked him to, and for a while it seemed almost true. Nell had been a seamstress before she married him, clever with her fingers, and cleverer with numbers, the kind of woman who could balance a household ledger by lamplight faster than most men could find their spectacles. Together they turned 400 acres of nothing into the kind of place neighbors envied, a white farmhouse, with blue shutters, a spring house cool with running water, fields that turned gold every August, like something out of a psalm. Nell remembered the smell of that farmhouse kitchen in autumn, cinnamon and wood smoke, flour dust catching the light through the window, the particular sweetness of apples going soft in a pie crust. She remembered Daniel's laugh, low and easy, the sound that had once meant home to her more than any four walls ever could. She remembered, too, though she rarely let herself dwell on it, the winter evening Silas Pruitt had first come calling on her, before Daniel ever did. Back when she was still a young seamstress new to the county, and Pruitt was a rising young banker, with slicked hair, and a proposal he seemed certain she would accept. She had turned him down gently, and he had smiled at her in that particular way of his, the smile that never once reached his eyes, and said that a woman ought to think carefully before she chose poorly. She had not thought of that evening again in 15 years. She would think of it often in the months to come. It was a drought that started the Hargroves' undoing, the kind that cracked the earth into a map of old age and turned green fields the color of ash. But it was Silas Pruitt who finished it, and he finished it, we now believe, with a particular relish that had little to do with business and everything to do with an old wound to his pride he had never once let heal. Pruitt owned the only bank in 3 counties, and when the railroad surveyors came through in the spring, marking a proposed spur line that would run straight across Hargrove land, he saw an opportunity dressed up as sympathy, and perhaps something more, a chance at last to take from Daniel Hargrove the very thing he'd wanted for himself 15 years before. He called Daniel's note due 8 months early, citing some clause buried so deep in the paperwork that even the county lawyer needed a full day to find it. Daniel rode into town 3 times that summer to reason with him, hat in hand, and 3 times he rode home with his shoulders lower than before, saying nothing to Nell about what passed between them, though she always suspected Pruitt made sure to mention her name at least once during each visit, just to watch her husband's jaw tighten. The fever took Daniel that August, some said from the worry as much as the sickness itself, and Nell buried her husband in a plain pine box, because that was all the money that remained could purchase. She remembered kneeling in the dirt afterward, with Briar pressed against her side, the dog whining softly at her collar, as though he understood, in whatever way dogs understand grief, that something essential had gone out of the world that day, and would not return. Pruitt foreclosed on the farm 11 days later. He did not attend the funeral, but he sent a clerk to post the notice on her door, before the flowers she'd laid on Daniel's grave had even wilted, and townsfolk who witnessed the posting said the clerk looked almost ashamed to be delivering it, though shame, evidently, was not contagious enough to reach the man who'd sent him. The town watched all of this happen the way towns do, with soft sympathy and hard indifference, murmuring behind cupped hands, offering nothing sturdier than pity. Women brought bread to her door and left before she could properly thank them, as though poverty itself might be catching. Men who had once tipped their hats to Daniel Hargrove now crossed the street rather than meet Nell's eye, uncertain what a ruined widow required of them beyond avoidance. Nell moved into a narrow room above the mercantile, took in mending work for pennies a stitch, and learned to walk past the bank without letting her face show anything at all, though her stomach twisted into a fist each time she passed its painted windows and saw Pruitt's silhouette moving behind the glass, prosperous and unbothered. Briar had been Daniel's dog first, a rangy copper hound with a white blaze down his nose and a habit of following Daniel's boots so closely the two of them seemed stitched together at the ankle. When Daniel died, the animal simply transferred his devotion to Nell without ceremony or hesitation, curling at her feet each night above the mercantile as though standing guard against a grief too large for one woman to carry alone. He grew thinner that winter too, sharing whatever scraps Nell could spare, and yet he never once whimpered for more than what she offered, watching her instead, with a steady, patient attentiveness that she came, in her darker hours, to depend on more than she liked to admit. She grew thin that year, she grew quiet. But there was a particular set to her jaw that never fully broke, and the women who brought her charity bread sometimes remarked, not unkindly, that Nell Hargrove had a look about her like a woman waiting for something, though none of them could have said what, and Nell herself, if pressed, could not have named it either. She only knew that some stubborn ember in her refused to go fully cold, no matter how many months she spent counting pennies by lamplight with Briar's chin resting heavy across her feet. There was one evening, deep in that hard winter, when the loneliness pressed close enough that she nearly let it win. She'd run out of coal oil 3 days early and sat instead in the near dark, mending a stranger's shirt by the thin light leaking through the shutters, when the old grief rose up in her chest, so sharply she had to set the needle down. Briar rose without being asked and pressed his full weight against her side on the narrow bed, resting his head in her lap in that particular way he'd learned from Daniel, who used to do the very same thing with his boots propped by the fire. She wept into his fur for a long while that night, and when she finally slept, it was the dog's steady breathing, not any comfort of her own making, that carried her through until morning. She never spoke of that night to another living soul, but she credited it, quietly, as the moment she decided she would not simply fade the way the town seemed to expect of her. Spring came slow that year, and with it came the auction notices posted along the mercantile wall, first for a failed dry goods store, then a widow's furniture, then, in early autumn, the modest estate of Tobias Wren. Nell had taken to reading every notice twice, not out of any real hope, but out of the habit poverty teaches, the habit of a woman who has learned that opportunity rarely announces itself plainly, and must instead be hunted for in the smallest print. What none of them knew, what we are about to tell you, is that the waiting was almost over, and it would begin with $1 and a dead man's barn. Keep watching, because what her dog was about to find inside those walls would turn everything Coldwater Bend believed about that overlooked land on its head, and it would do more than restore Nell Hargrove's fortune. It would settle, at long last, a debt Silas Pruitt had never once imagined coming due. The estate sale of Tobias Wren's property came up that October, forced by the county, after months of unpaid taxes on a parcel nobody particularly wanted. Wren had been a strange figure in Coldwater Bend for as long as anyone could remember. An old basketweaver who lived alone at the edge of town, selling his willow and reed baskets at the Saturday market, but rarely speaking more than a dozen words to any soul who wasn't buying. Children said he talked to his tools. Adults said he'd gone soft in the head sometime after his wife passed, years back, and simply never recovered his footing in the world of ordinary men. Nell herself had bought a market basket from him once, years earlier, back when she still had coin to spare for such things, and she remembered him pressing it into her hands with a strange, searching look, as though he were trying to decide whether she was the sort of person who noticed things other people missed. When Wren died that September, found peacefully in his rocking chair with a half-finished basket still resting in his lap, the town mourned him the way one mourns a fixture rather than a friend, with a shrug and a shallow grave, and a handful of neighbors who attended his burial mostly out of habit rather than affection. His land amounted to little on paper: a sagging one-room house, not worth saving, 3 acres of scrub, and a barn so old and tilted that the county assessor had marked it for demolition before the sale even began. Nobody bid on the barn lot. Nobody wanted rotted wood, and a dead man's leftover reed baskets stacked to the rafters. Nell had come to the sale only because a widow in her position learned to attend every sale in the county, hunting for anything, a length of cloth, a chipped teapot, she might resell for a coin or two toward next month's rent. She had exactly $1 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, the very last of her money, meant for flour and lamp oil. But when the auctioneer called the barn lot, and no hand rose, Briar did something he had never done before. He stood, ears pricked, body rigid with an attention Nell had only ever seen him show toward something alive, the way he'd once gone still and quiet at the sight of a fox slipping through their old wheat rows. He whined low in his throat and pulled toward the barn itself, straining against the length of rope that served as his lead, and when Nell told him to heel, he looked back at her with an expression so insistent, so uncharacteristically stubborn, that it startled her into stillness right there in the crowd. $1, she heard herself say. The crowd chuckled. Someone murmured that poor widow Hargrove had finally lost the last of her sense, throwing good money after a barn fit only for kindling. The auctioneer, eager to be rid of the lot, brought his gavel down before anyone could reconsider, and just like that, the barn and its 3 acres of scrub belonged to Nell Hargrove. From somewhere near the back of the crowd, she thought she saw Silas Pruitt watching, arms folded, his expression unreadable in a way that would only make sense to her much later. She told herself, walking home that evening with Briar trotting ahead of her, tail high for the first time in months, that she had made a foolish trade. She did not yet understand that her dog had just led her toward the only fortune left unclaimed in Coldwater Bend. The barn stood at a lean, as though it had spent years bracing itself against a wind that never quite finished blowing it down. Inside, the air held the particular hush of abandoned places, dust motes turning slow in shafts of amber light, the sweet dry smell of old cut willow, and beneath it, fainter, the mineral scent of iron gone to rust. Baskets hung from the rafters in every stage of completion, some so fine and tightly woven they seemed almost to shimmer, others left half-finished as though Tobias Wren had simply set down his work one afternoon and never returned to it. Nell stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand resting on the splintered frame, feeling the peculiar weight of stepping into a stranger's unfinished life. Briar did not share her hesitation. He moved through the barn with his nose low, working methodically along the walls, and Nell noticed with a small ache in her chest that this was the most purposeful she had seen him since Daniel's death, as though some old instinct in him had finally found a task worth the doing. She followed him past a workbench cluttered with strips of soaked willow and bone-handled tools, past a wall of baskets arranged by size like a congregation of silent witnesses, past a coil of dried reed, still curled in the shape of the hands that last touched it, until he stopped at the barn's rear wall and would not be moved. She tried, at first, to coax him elsewhere, worried he'd caught the scent of a rat's nest or some nesting bird best left undisturbed, but Briar sat firmly on his haunches before that particular stretch of wall, ears forward, tail sweeping slow across the dusty floorboards, and gave a soft, insistent whine that seemed to say, as plainly as words might have, "Here, look here." When she finally knelt beside him, and pressed her palm flat against the wood, she felt something her eyes had missed, a seam, subtle as a held breath, running vertical through what should have been solid planking. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lamplight as the October evening thickened into dark outside, to understand what she was looking at. The rear wall of the barn was not entirely wood. Tobias Wren, in his decades of quiet solitary work, had woven a false panel of reed and willow so cunning, so seamlessly matched to the grain and color of the boards around it, that it read as ordinary wall to anyone who did not know to look. It was, she realized, with a slow shiver crawling up her arms, the work of a master. The same hands that made his market baskets had built him a door that the entire town had walked past for 20 years without once suspecting its purpose. Briar pressed his nose to the base of the panel, and gave one sharp, decisive bark, and something in his certainty steadied her fingers as she began working the woven latch free. Her heart beat strangely fast, not with fear exactly, but with the particular dread of a woman who has learned, through hard experience, not to hope for too much. "We should tell you now," Because we promised you the truth of this story, and because what came next changed everything, that Tobias Wren had not gone soft in the head at all. He had been hiding. Behind the panel lay a shallow recessed space, no deeper than a man's forearm, lined with dry cedar shavings to keep the damp away. Inside sat two things: a leather satchel, cracked with age but carefully oiled to preserve it, and a small iron strongbox, rusted at its corners but intact. Nell's hands shook as she drew them both into the lamplight. Briar sat pressed against her side now, no longer scratching or whining but watching with an almost solemn stillness, as though he understood the gravity of what they'd uncovered better than she did herself, his ears flicking toward the barn door every few moments, as if standing sentinel over the moment. The strongbox held gold dust and raw nuggets, wrapped in scraps of soft cloth, not a fortune to rival a mine baron's, but more wealth than Nell had touched in her entire life, the patient accumulation, she would later understand, of a man who'd spent 30 quiet years panning a creek nobody else bothered to work. She sifted her fingers through it once, marveling at the cool, heavy grit of it, before setting it carefully aside. It was the satchel that mattered more, and its contents would prove far heavier than gold. Inside lay a bundle of papers, brittle and yellowed, bound with waxed twine, an original water rights claim to Coldwater Creek itself, filed and legally recorded some 40 years earlier under the name Tobias Wren, predating every deed the town currently operated under, including, she would soon discover, the very deed Silas Pruitt's bank used to justify the fees it quietly charged half the farms in the valley for creek access. Beneath the claim lay something else too, a short, unsigned letter in Wren's own careful looping hand, dated some 15 years back, mentioning a generous offer of silence, from a man he never named outright, but described only as the banker who fears the creek more than God. Nell read that line 3 times by lamplight, Briar's warm weight solid against her leg, before she understood its meaning. Nell sat back on her heels, the papers trembling in her hands, and understood 2 things with sudden bone-deep clarity. The first was that Tobias Wren had known something about this town's water that could have upended half its fortunes, and had chosen, for reasons she might never fully know, to say nothing, and live small instead, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of some quiet grief of his own, that had made him distrust the world's opinion of anything he might claim. The second was that she now held, quite by accident, the means to unmake the very bank that had unmade her. That should have felt like triumph. It did not yet, because a mystery this large does not simply announce its meaning in one evening, and Nell Hargrove was about to learn that some secrets, once uncovered, come looking for the person who found them. What she didn't yet know was that someone in Coldwater Bend had been searching for these very papers for years, and that her dog's discovery had just put a target on her door. Stay with us, because the town was about to notice that the widow everyone pitied had stopped acting like a woman with nothing left to lose, and the man who feared that letter's contents most was about to make a mistake that would cost him everything. Word travels strangely in a small town, not through any single mouth, but through a dozen half-seen glances stitched together, until the whole street somehow knows a thing no one quite said aloud. Within a week, Coldwater Bend understood that Widow Hargrove had found something in that old barn, though the particulars blurred and multiplied with each retelling. Some said gold, some said a map to gold, nobody yet said water rights, because Nell had told no one, not even the kindly women who brought her bread, and she had taken to locking the strongbox and satchel beneath a loose floorboard in her rented room each night, with Briar sleeping directly atop the boards as though he alone understood the true weight of what they guarded. She spent those first days in a fog of careful calculation, turning the water rights claim over in her mind, the way she used to balance a household ledger, weighing what it might mean, who she might trust with the knowledge, how a woman with no lawyer and no standing in town might ever hope to make such a claim stick against a man as powerful as Silas Pruitt. She thought, more than once, of simply burying the whole business back beneath the barn floor, and living quietly off the gold alone, but each time that thought surfaced, she caught Briar watching her with those same steady eyes he'd worn the night he found the false wall, and something in his patient, unwavering attention reminded her that some doors, once opened, cannot honestly be closed again. Silas Pruitt heard the rumors on a Tuesday, and rode out to the old Wren property himself by Thursday, ostensibly to inspect a barn now legally hers but which he insisted, in that smiling voice that never touched his eyes, might still fall under a lien he could contest. Nell met him in the yard with Briar planted at her side, and though the dog made no move toward the banker, a low steady growl rolled from his chest the entire time Pruitt stood on that land, a sound Nell had genuinely never heard him make before, not once, not even at strangers passing on the road. It was as though the animal recognized, in some way words could not explain, that this particular man had been the architect of every loss that had brought them both to this barn in the first place. Pruitt's smile thinned at the growl, but did not disappear. He walked a slow circle around the barn's exterior, running one gloved hand along the weathered boards with a proprietary air that made Nell's jaw tighten, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same silky condescension she remembered from 15 years before, back when she'd turned down his offer of marriage, and watched his expression curdle for just an instant, before he mastered it. "Careful with that animal, Widow Hargrove," he said. "Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt over an old man's junk, though I confess, I'm surprised at your good fortune. Tobias Wren never struck me as a man who kept anything worth finding." "Didn't he?" Nell said, and watched something flicker behind Pruitt's eyes. Not quite fear, but its cousin, wariness, before he smoothed his expression back into practiced calm. She told him, evenly, that the barn and everything found within it belonged to her by legal purchase, witnessed and recorded, and that he was welcome to bring whatever lien he believed he held before the county judge. He left without argument, but Nell had lived in Coldwater Bend long enough to know that a man like Pruitt did not simply walk away from a threat to his fortune, and a man with an old wound to his pride did not walk away from a woman who'd once refused him, and now held the means to ruin him besides. He regrouped, he waited, and 3 nights later, someone tried to break into the barn. Briar woke her before she heard anything herself, launching off the bed with a bark so sharp and sudden, it seemed to split the night in two. By the time Nell reached the window, lamp in hand, she saw only the shape of a man's back disappearing into the dark toward the tree line, spooked off before he'd so much as touched the barn door, because Briar, we should tell you plainly, was never in any danger that night, nor at any point in this story. He stood his ground at the fence line barking, until the intruder was long gone, then trotted back to Nell's side, with his tail low, and his hackles still raised, pressing his flank against her legs, as if to confirm with his whole body that she was safe, that whatever had come slinking through the dark had failed, and that he intended to make quite certain it would not try again. It was Briar's alarm, more than anything, that convinced Nell the time for quiet caution had passed. The following morning, she rode into town with the satchel wrapped in oilcloth, and tucked beneath her coat, Briar trotting close at her heel, tail held with a new stiffness that Nell had come to recognize as his particular brand of vigilance, and requested an audience at the county courthouse. She did not go to Pruitt, she went over him, straight to Judge Alden Marsh, a stern, unhurried man known throughout the valley for taking his time and taking no bribes, and she laid Tobias Wren's 40-year-old water rights claim across his desk with hands that had finally stopped shaking, along with the old Basketweaver's unsigned letter about a banker who feared the creek more than God. The judge read slowly. He read twice, and when he finished, he looked up at Nell with an expression she would remember for the rest of her days. Not pity, which she'd had a bellyful of already, but something closer to respect, the kind she had not been offered by anyone in Coldwater Bend since before Daniel's death. The town meeting was called for the following Saturday, and word of it spread faster than any rumor of buried gold ever had, because this time the words "water rights" and "Pruitt" traveled together, and every farmer in the valley who'd ever paid the bank's Quiet Creek access fee understood immediately what that pairing might mean for the money they'd handed over for years. The meeting hall was packed to its rafters that evening, lantern light thick with the smell of coal oil and nervous sweat, coats still damp from an early frost, and Nell Hargrove stood at the front of it, with Briar seated calm and steady beside her, no longer growling, no longer alarmed, simply present, the way he had been present for every turn of this story, watching over her the only way he knew how, his copper coat catching the lantern light like something almost deliberately dignified. Before the judge could speak, An elderly farmwife near the front row rose on her own accord and asked, in a voice that carried clean to the rafters, whether it was true that Tobias Wren himself had once tried to warn the town council about the creek fees, years back, only to be waved off as a man too strange to be taken seriously. Judge Marsh confirmed it was recorded in the old council minutes, buried and long forgotten, and a fresh ripple of unease moved through the hall, the particular unease of a town realizing it had ignored a warning simply because the man giving it wove baskets instead of speeches. Nell felt Briar shift closer against her skirts at the stir in the room, steady as ever, and found herself grateful, not for the first time, that he asked nothing of her in that moment, but her hand resting on his head. Judge Marsh read the claim aloud to the room. He explained, in plain unhurried language, that Tobias Wren's recorded rights to Coldwater Creek predated the paperwork Pruitt's bank had used for 2 decades to justify its fees, and that under the law, those rights now passed, through Nell's legal purchase of the Wren estate, to her. The silence that followed broke into a rising murmur of disbelief, and then, as the arithmetic of it settled over the room, years of fees paid for water that was never rightfully Pruitt's to charge for, into something closer to fury, though none of it aimed at Nell. Pruitt tried to speak. He rose from his seat near the back, that smile straining now at its edges, and began some practiced line about clerical confusion and honest misunderstanding, but the room had already turned against him. Farmers who'd smiled thinly at him across his own desk for years stood to demand an accounting. A neighbor Nell recognized from her own farming days, a man named Ezra Coates, who'd lost 40 acres to Pruitt's bank the very same season she'd lost her own land, stood and asked, in a voice that shook with restrained anger, whether the banker cared to explain the letter Judge Marsh had just read into record, the one about an old man paid to keep quiet about a creek he feared more than God. Pruitt had no answer for that, only a tightening around his mouth, that told the whole room everything his words had failed to. The bank's own board, present that night, and eager suddenly to distance themselves from a scandal not of their making, called for an immediate audit of Pruitt's dealings before the meeting had even properly adjourned. Within a month, records would surface showing he had known of the Wren claim's existence for years, buried in old county filings, and had quietly bought Wren's silence with just enough money to keep the old man fed and forgotten, until Wren, in some final act of quiet defiance, chose instead to hide the truth in his walls rather than let Pruitt destroy it outright, weaving his rebellion into reed and willow the way another man might have carved it into stone. Silas Pruitt did not go to prison. The law of that time and place was not built to reach that far, but he lost everything a man like him valued more than freedom. He lost his bank, forced into resignation by his own board within the season. He lost the respect he'd spent 2 decades cultivating, replaced overnight by the particular, permanent scorn a small town reserves for those caught cheating its own, and by more than a few sharp questions about a marriage proposal, 15 years old, that suddenly looked less like romance, and more like the first small cruelty in a much longer pattern. He left Coldwater Bend before the snow came, and no one in town could later recall a single soul who saw him off, nor a single soul who missed him. Nell Hargrove, for her part, did the thing that made Judge Marsh call her, years afterward, the finest example of character he'd witnessed on that bench. She did not charge the valley's farmers a single cent for the water that was now legally hers to control. She filed the rights over to a town water cooperative instead, structured so that every family in the valley held equal claim to the creek that had sustained them all along, the very thing Tobias Wren, in his own strange and solitary way, had perhaps always intended, before fear or grief had convinced him to hide rather than share what he knew. With the gold from the strongbox, modest as it was, Nell rebuilt a small house on the old Wren land, kept the barn standing as a workshop of her own, and took up, of all things, basket weaving, taught to her, slowly and patiently, by the notes and half-finished patterns Tobias Wren had left behind in that barn, as if passing his quiet craft to the one person in Coldwater Bend who'd finally taken the time to look past his walls. Briar lived out his years at her side in that rebuilt house by the creek, growing gray around the muzzle, but never losing the particular alertness that had once led a grieving widow to a dollar barn nobody else wanted. Neighbors who visited often remarked that the old hound seemed to keep a permanent watch over the barn's back wall, long after there was anything left to guard there, as though some part of him remembered, and simply wished to stand sentinel over the place where everything had finally turned. There is a kind of value this world too often overlooks. In old barns, in quiet men, in widows the town has already written off, in dogs who see what the rest of us walk straight past. Tobias Wren spent 30 years hiding a fortune inside walls nobody thought to examine, and it took one grieving woman, $1, and one loyal hound named Briar, to finally set it free into hands that would use it well. If you found a hidden piece of history like that tomorrow, tucked away and forgotten by everyone but the one soul patient enough to look, would you keep it, or would you share it? Until next time, stay close.